Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches y bienvenido o bienvenida a este video. Hello and welcome to today's lesson. Fue versus era. Estuvo versus estaba. What's the difference? Now, I struggled with this for a long time when I was learning Spanish, so hopefully by the end of this lesson, you will know exactly how to differentiate between these four little words. They're just four words, but they can be a bit confusing. Now, I'd like to say, if you're interested in learning more Spanish with me, I have a brand new free Spanish community. Click the link in the description to join. It is free, it is awesome, and you can actually communicate with me one-on-one via direct message. It is very cool, so check it out by clicking the link in the video description. Okay, without further ado, fue is coming from the verb ser, meaning to be, and that is in the preterite. Okay, the preterite is the one time in the past, and ser is for things that are permanent. Okay, so it's tricky here because we have different layers going on. Oftentimes for us as Spanish learners, it's hard to differentiate when to use the preterite versus the imperfect. And it also can be tricky to use ser versus estar. So when you're adding those layers, it can get really tricky, which is why this can be hard for us as Spanish learners. Okay? Now, era is also coming from the verb ser, meaning to be, and it is the imperfect tense, the imperfect for ongoing actions in the past. Okay? Estuvo, coming from estar, meaning to be, but is temporary, and it's the preterite tense, okay, so a one-time action in the past. And then estaba, also coming from estar, meaning to be in a temporary state, and the imperfect for something that's ongoing in the past. Okay, so ser versus estar. Ser is permanent, estar is temporary. Okay, now sometimes we can use ser for the location of an event. Okay, for example, la fiesta fue en mi casa. You might think, well, that's not a permanent thing because the party was in my house, but then it's not anymore. But when it comes to events, we can use ser. Okay, so we wouldn't necessarily use estar. However, ser is permanent, okay? Yo soy Nathan, okay? I am Nathan, and that's not going to change. That is a permanent thing. Yo soy Nathan. I wouldn't say yo estoy Nathan. I would say yo soy Nathan, okay? And estar is for things that are temporary, and most often these are used for things of location. So, estoy en México. I am in Mexico. Estoy en México, okay? All right, or estoy cansado. I am tired. Estoy cansado. That is a temporary thing. It's not forever, okay? That is not something that is permanent about me. I'm tired right now, but later I will be energetic, and then maybe I'll be tired, and then I'll maybe be whatever, okay? All right, so then we have the preterite versus the imperfect, okay? Preterite, one-time action in the past. Imperfect, ongoing action in the past, okay? So for the preterite, yo fui a la fiesta. I went to the party, okay? I wasn't going to the party. I didn't used to go to the party. I went to the party, okay? That's the preterite, one-time action in the past. Next, imperfect, ongoing action in the past, okay? Yo iba a ese restaurante cada domingo, okay? I used to go to that restaurant every Sunday. Yo iba a ese restaurante cada domingo. Okay, that's an ongoing thing. I would go. It would happen frequently. It didn't just happen one time. It happened many times. And therefore, we'll use the imperfect. So if you're struggling with knowing the difference between ser and estar and the difference between the preterite versus the imperfect, I recommend that you get that down first before worrying or stressing too much about this. Because if you get these down, then hopefully this will be much easier for you. Okay? All right, so now let's take a look at some examples. La fiesta fue increíble. Okay, the party was incredible. So why would it be fue instead of era? Okay, because you could argue that the party was going on and it was incredible. And the reality is, you actually could use era in this case. If you said la fiesta era increíble, I would understand what you're trying to say. However, the idea here is that we went to the party and it was awesome. We went, we had a great time, and it's over, okay? You could argue that while it was going on, it was incredible, and therefore you would use the imperfect, la fiesta era increíble. And oftentimes, the imperfect is used in conjunction with the preterite. So I could say something like, la fiesta era increíble hasta que Bob llegó. For example, okay? The party was incredible until Bob arrived. Okay? Imperfect, or preterite, okay? Llegó, okay? La fiesta fue increíble. So the party was incredible, okay? Fue, okay? Ser, okay? So the characteristic of the party, okay? The party was awesome. It was a great time. But the party has now ended, okay? Preterite, boom, it's over. So we'll use fue, okay? La fiesta fue increíble. Okay? Fue el lunes pasado. It was last Monday. Okay, this could be an event, a party, whatever. Fue el lunes pasado. So, la fiesta fue increíble. Fue el lunes pasado. The party was incredible, and it was last Monday. Okay? Why are we having a party on Monday? I don't know, but life is short. Fue. Okay? It was. Okay? It was last Monday. Okay? This is a permanent thing, but it was a one-time action in the past, and it's over. It gets confusing because we're kind of talking about this idea of permanence or this idea of something being temporary, but then we're also saying, oh yeah, but this is permanent, but it happened once and it's over now. So it's a little bit confusing, okay? Fue el lunes pasado, okay? It was last Monday. All right, let's take a look at this side of the whiteboard. Era muy amable, okay? Él era muy amable. He was very nice. That is something that is permanent about him or her, right? If I don't put the subject pronoun, if I just say era muy amable, I don't know if I'm saying él, if I'm saying ella, if I'm saying usted, okay? So, él era muy amable. That is something about him, okay? It's not like he was nice one day and then he wasn't the next. That is a character trait of his. He was continually nice, okay? And the idea here is we don't know if he ever stopped being nice, okay? You could say fue muy amable. You could say él fue muy amable conmigo. He was very nice to me. But he was nice to me, but it was over. It was like we went to the party, I saw this guy, and he was really nice to me. Fue muy amable conmigo. He was very nice to me, and that was it. It ended. But this is the idea that this is something about him that has consistently been happening. Era muy amable. Okay, that it's not like he stopped being nice. Okay, he was nice, and that's it. Okay, so ser, it's about him, and imperfect, it's ongoing. Okay, él era muy amable. Cuando era niño, yo jugaba mucho. Okay, so when I was a kid, I would play a lot. Remember that era can take on the translation of was in this example, when I was a kid, but it can also mean when I used to be. Okay, maybe in this example it sounds a little bit odd, but remember the imperfect can take on that translation of used to. Just like this, right? When I was a kid, I used to play a lot, or I would play a lot. Now, I made a video about this. Do not confuse the imperfect with the conditional. Jugaba is not the same as jugaría, okay? Yo jugaría baseball si fuera tú, for example. I would play baseball if I were you. That is much different than yo jugaba baseball cuando era niño. I would play baseball. Two different ideas there, so be careful. That's why oftentimes I'll teach my students to translate the idea of the imperfect into used to. Because if you get used to translating that as would, then you might confuse it with the conditional tense. Two different tenses, okay? Cuando era niño, yo jugaba mucho. So when I was a kid, I would play a lot, okay? Era, I was a kid. Now, you might think, well, why wouldn't estar be used here? I was a kid, but I'm not anymore. Well, in Spanish, we would say that era, okay, I was a kid and I was continually being a kid, but the imperfect, right, ongoing, okay, I was continually being a kid. I didn't necessarily stop being a kid. Obviously, now I'm not a kid, unfortunately, but the idea is I was continually being a kid. That was a thing about me, okay, a trait or whatever you want to say, permanent thing about me, and that was a continual thing, okay, when I was a kid. It's not like I was a kid one day and then I became an adult the next, okay? I was, continually being a kid and then eventually I became an adult, okay? La comida estuvo rica, okay? The food was tasty. Oh, this is confusing. Why is it estuvo? Why isn't it fue or era? Okay, well, when we talk about food, for example, and if it was tasty, oftentimes we'll use the verb estar, okay? Let's think about this in the present tense. La comida está muy rica. For example, the food is very tasty. The idea here is that, yes, the food is tasty, but the idea is we're going to eat it and it's not going to exist anymore. So it's a temporary thing, okay? La comida estuvo rica, okay? The idea is it's a temporary thing. We ate it. Estuvo, because we ate it and it's gone. Estuvo rica, okay? Estuvo en México por una semana. So he or she was in Mexico for a week, right? So por una semana. When it comes to the preterite, okay, if we're talking about a time period and we're using the preterite, it needs to be a specific time period. So here we have the preterite, and he was in Mexico, right? It's not like he was permanently in Mexico. No, he was temporarily there. So we would say estuvo en México por una semana. I could also say él estaba en México. Boom. If I were to say él estaba en México por una semana, it sounds weird because por una semana is specific. So we would use the preterite, okay? But if I would just want to say, oh yeah, él estaba en México. Oh yeah, he used to be in Mexico, or he was in Mexico. Technically, that's okay too. If I were to just say estaba en México or estuvo en México, technically, both are correct. They just have different, slightly different meanings. Estaba en Mexico, he was in Mexico, or he used to be in Mexico. We don't know if he ever left Mexico, if he's still there. Whereas estuvo en Mexico would mean he was in Mexico and it's done. He's not there anymore. Okay, that's a completed action. Estaba cansado después de trabajar. I was tired after working. Estaba cansado después de trabajar. Now, you could say estuve cansado because I was tired, but I'm not anymore. However, the idea here is I was tired after work, and we don't know if I ever stopped being tired. Of course, I probably did, but the idea here is that was an ongoing state at the time, and therefore it'll be estaba cansado. Okay, estaba cansado después de trabajar. Like I said, this is really get a little confusing, and kind of we get into these gray areas. Now, here's what I'll say to you. Estuvo is used way less than estaba. So if you're not sure, just use estaba, okay? You might technically be incorrect. However, this is important to note. Oftentimes, native Spanish speakers will mix these two, okay? They'll mix up estaba and estuvo, or fue and era. No one's gonna be turning heads or being like, huh, that sounded weird, if you make that mistake, okay? So when in doubt, use estaba instead of estuvo, okay? Fue and era are both used, kind of interchangeably, so. Estaba lloviendo cuando salí. It was raining when I left, okay? That's an ongoing thing, okay? Estaba, right? The imperfect, it's an ongoing action in the past, but we wouldn't say era lloviendo because that's not a permanent character trait about the verb raining, okay? We're just saying it was raining, okay? It's not going to rain forever, but in this example, it was continuing to rain. So we use the imperfect and then estar. Estaba lloviendo cuando salí. Like I had mentioned, it's very common the imperfect will be used along with the preterite, okay? Yo estaba estudiando cuando mi papá me llamó. So I was studying when my dad called me, for example. Okay, I know this can be very confusing. Feel free to take a screenshot of this just so you can differentiate between these 4 different things, okay? I know this is confusing. No worries if you're still getting tripped up by it. It's just going to take some practice. The most important thing is to understand the differences between ser and estar and the preterite versus the imperfect. Okay? Like I said, I have a free Spanish community. It is seriously incredible. Please go check it out by clicking the link in the video description. Muchas gracias por ver este video y espero que te haya ayudado. Que tengas muy buen día. Hasta luego.